It was May 1945, and the world stood in silence as the guns of Europe finally fell quiet. Smoke still curled over the ruins of Berlin, a city that had once been the proud capital of Hitler's Third Reich but was now reduced to dust, fire, and ghosts. The swastika that once hung above the Reich Chancellery had been torn down. Soviet soldiers, their uniforms coated with ash and exhaustion, raised the red flag over the shattered Reichstag. The war that had begun with Germany's roar ended with its whimper. But in the silence that followed, a new conflict began to stir, one that would not be fought with tanks and bombs, but with fear, ideology, and walls. Germany lay broken not just in body, but in spirit. The Allies who had fought together to destroy Hitler's empire now faced a new and uneasy question: what should be done with the ruins? The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France had fought shoulder to shoulder against Nazi tyranny, but their unity was only skin deep. Behind the smiles at victory parades and the handshakes at conferences, there were deep cracks, political, ideological, and personal. The war had created strange allies, and peace was about to reveal how incompatible they really were. At the Yalta Conference earlier that year, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin had sat together to discuss the post-war world. They agreed that Germany would be disarmed, demilitarized, and divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allies. It sounded like a practical solution at the time: 4 victors, 4 zones, 1 defeated nation. But beneath the surface of this arrangement lay an invisible fault line that would soon split not just Germany, but the entire world. As Soviet troops occupied eastern Germany, their presence carried more than just victory, it carried ideology. Stalin's Soviet Union believed in communism, the idea that the state should control everything for the supposed good of the people. To the west, however, the United States and its allies were determined to rebuild Europe under democracy and capitalism. Neither side trusted the other, and both saw the future of Germany as the key to Europe's fate. Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire, became the heart of this new tension. Although the city lay deep within the Soviet occupation zone, it too was divided into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. This arrangement would prove to be one of history's most ironic and explosive compromises. The capital of a destroyed empire was now the front line of a new global struggle. In the early days of occupation, the ruins of Germany were a picture of despair. Millions were homeless. Cities were piles of rubble. Food was scarce, and winter was merciless. The Allied forces tried to bring order to chaos, but their visions for Germany's future began to drift apart. In the West, the Americans and British wanted to rebuild a strong, democratic Germany, one that could stand as a bulwark against future tyranny. In the East, the Soviets had a different plan: to reshape Germany in their own image, under communist rule and Soviet influence. By 1946, the lines between the former allies had hardened into something darker. Stalin began installing communist governments across Eastern Europe in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Churchill, no longer Britain's prime minister but still a commanding voice, warned the world in his famous speech, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. That iron curtain was more than a metaphor: it was a boundary of fear, mistrust, and ideology that would divide Europe for the next 40 years. Germany was at the very center of that curtain. In the Soviet zone, the new authorities quickly took control of land, factories, and media. Political opponents were silenced, and socialist doctrines began to dominate schools and newspapers. Meanwhile, in the Western zones, the Allies introduced democratic reforms, encouraged free markets, and launched the Marshall Plan, a massive American effort to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. For the people of Germany, it was like living in 2 different worlds separated by a line of barbed wire and suspicion. Berlin, though technically still united, became a pressure cooker of competing ideas. People in the eastern part of the city could walk into the west and see a completely different reality: shops with food, lights that stayed on, people who spoke freely. The Soviets saw this as a threat, a hole in their ideological wall. In 1948, they made their move. In an attempt to drive the Western powers out of Berlin, the Soviets cut off all road, rail, and canal access to the western sectors of the city. Overnight, more than 2 million people in West Berlin were cut off from supplies. But instead of surrendering, the Allies responded with one of the most remarkable humanitarian efforts in history, the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew day and night, dropping food, coal, and medicine into the encircled city. Children watched from rooftops as candy parachutes fell from the sky, gifts from pilots they called chocolate flyers. It was a victory of determination over blockade, and by May 1949, the Soviets lifted their grip. The airlift had shown that the West would not abandon Berlin and that the division of Germany was now permanent. Within months, the divide was formalized. In May 1949, the Western zones united to form the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, with Bonn as its temporary capital. Just a few months later, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, ruled by a communist government loyal to Moscow. The dream of a unified Germany had died, replaced by two rival states, two different visions of freedom, both claiming to represent the true German people. As the 1950s began, the scars of war were slowly covered by new buildings and new ideologies. In West Germany, factories roared back to life, fueled by American aid and democratic reform. In the East, industry was rebuilt under strict state control, and citizens lived under constant watch from the secret police. Families were split by the invisible borders that cut through towns and even through hearts. The physical wall had not yet risen, but the psychological one was already there. The ashes of 1945 had given birth to a divided world. Germany was no longer the aggressor, it had become the prize, the stage upon which the Cold War would play out. Every street in Berlin, every checkpoint, every radio signal was now part of a much larger struggle, a silent war for influence, survival, and ideology. The allies of yesterday had become the enemies of tomorrow. And as the sun set over a divided Europe, one thing was clear: the war was over, but the peace had only just begun. The Wall of Shadows. It began not with an explosion, but with a whisper. The kind of whisper that spreads quietly through crowded train stations, dimly lit bars, and kitchen tables, the whisper that maybe, just maybe, things were better on the other side. By the early 1950s, Germany was no longer a single nation but two distinct worlds sharing the same haunted soil. The wounds of war had stopped bleeding, but they had not healed. Instead, they had hardened into a scar that split the heart of Europe in two. West Germany, rebuilt with American aid, hummed with life. Its cities rose from the rubble like phoenixes, gleaming with neon signs and optimism. Volkswagen cars rolled out of factories, children went to school with full stomachs, and new homes replaced bombed-out shells. The people there began to believe in tomorrow again. But across the invisible line, East Germany told a different story. Behind the watchtowers and barbed wire of the Soviet zone, factories worked under state control, newspapers praised the government, and suspicion was a daily companion. Freedom had been replaced with fear, and loyalty had become law. The two Germanys were supposed to coexist peacefully, but their very existence was a challenge to each other. Every success in the West was a silent insult to the East. Every freedom enjoyed by a West Berliner was a reminder of what the East had lost. And the people noticed. Trains still ran between the zones, roads still connected the divided halves of Berlin, and families were still allowed to visit. For many East Germans, the border was not yet a prison, it was a doorway. They began to leave. Slowly at first, then in floods. Teachers, doctors, engineers, students, thousands crossed the border each week, walking through checkpoints or simply stepping onto a tram that ran from East Berlin to the west. By 1958, nearly 3 million East Germans had fled to the other side, draining the Soviet zone of its brightest minds and strongest hands. The East German government called them traitors. The rest of the world called them refugees. Either way, it was a crisis that could not continue. Moscow was furious. Nikita Khrushchev, the new Soviet leader after Stalin's death, saw Berlin as the weak spot in the communist system, a bleeding wound that needed to be closed. He demanded that the Western powers leave Berlin and recognize it as part of East Germany. But Washington, London, and Paris refused. To them, West Berlin was more than a city, it was a symbol of freedom surrounded by a sea of oppression. "We will stay in Berlin," President Kennedy would later declare, "and the people of the free world will stand by us." The standoff had begun. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, tensions reached a boiling point. Every month, thousands more fled the east. East German soldiers watched helplessly as citizens walked past them into the west, not in secret, but in daylight, carrying luggage, waving goodbye to the system that had promised equality and delivered control. The government tried propaganda, stricter laws, even emotional appeals to patriotism. Nothing worked. People kept leaving. And then, one night in August 1961, the escape route vanished. At midnight on August 13, East German police and soldiers rolled out under orders from their leader, Walter Ulbricht. They carried barbed wire, wooden posts, and guns. Streets were blocked. Train lines were cut. Families were torn apart while they slept. When the city woke the next morning, Berlin was no longer a city of passage, it was a city of walls. The wire barriers quickly became concrete, stretching like a scar across streets, gardens, even cemeteries. The Berlin Wall had risen, and with it, an era of despair. The wall was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a message to the West, that communism would not yield, and to the East, that freedom was a dream they could no longer chase. Over the following months, the wall grew taller, thicker, deadlier. Guard towers dotted its length, manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. Families found themselves on opposite sides, waving across fences they could never cross. Lovers were separated mid-date, workers cut off from their jobs, children from their schools. The same streets that had once echoed with footsteps now stood silent except for the sound of patrol boots and barking dogs. For the Western world, Berlin became both a tragedy and a symbol. Cameras from across the globe captured the wall, gray, cold, and merciless, slicing through a city that had once stood for unity. But West Berlin refused to surrender its spirit. Artists painted murals on the western side of the wall, turning concrete into color. Jazz clubs played late into the night. The city thrived on defiance, a tiny island of democracy surrounded by barbed wire. "Ich bin ein Berliner," declared Kennedy when he visited in 1963, telling its people and the world that freedom was worth every risk, every wall, every wound. For East Berliners, the story was one of fear and quiet resistance. Some accepted the new reality, others plotted escape. Tunnels were dug under the wall, some barely wide enough for a crawling body. Balloons and makeshift aircraft were built in secret workshops. A few made it. Many did not. The wall claimed lives not just of those who were shot while fleeing, but of those who died slowly inside it, suffocating under the weight of silence and surveillance. The East German secret police, the Stasi, watched everything: neighbors spying on neighbors, children reporting on parents. Trust became a luxury few could afford. Beyond Berlin, the wall froze Europe into two opposing camps. To the west stretched NATO, led by the United States. To the east stood the Warsaw Pact, under Soviet command. Missiles, tanks, and propaganda became the weapons of a new kind of war. The Cold War one fought not to conquer land, but to win hearts and control minds. Germany, once the aggressor of two world wars, was now the victim of a conflict without end. And yet, life went on. Children were born who had never seen the other side. For them, the wall wasn't a tragedy, it was simply the horizon. East German propaganda called it the anti-fascist protection barrier, claiming it defended socialism from Western corruption. But everyone knew it wasn't built to keep enemies out, it was built to keep people in. Decades would pass before that truth crumbled. As the 1960s unfolded, the wall became a permanent scar not only on Berlin's landscape but on humanity's conscience. It stood as proof that fear could build cities and divide families, that ideologies could imprison entire nations. The guns had gone silent in 1945, but the war never truly ended, it just changed its form. Instead of battlefields, there were borders. Instead of bombs, there were lies. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Berlin, half free, half captive, the heartbeat of a divided world. The silent years. The wall stood. Cold, gray, and immovable, it sliced through Berlin like a scar carved into history. For those born after its rise, it wasn't a shock anymore, it was normal, like the weather or the seasons. But behind the stillness of its concrete face, the city breathed in whispers. East Berliners lived under the gaze of the state, while the West pulsed with restless freedom, neon lights, and the hum of possibility. Two worlds shared the same sky but not the same dreams. In the East, the government called it stability. The leaders of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, claimed they had achieved order, equality, and purpose. Streets were renamed after socialist heroes. Red flags fluttered in the wind. Schools taught children to honor the party and fear the West. But beneath that layer of obedience lay a quiet ache, a dull longing for something unspoken. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, made sure it stayed that way. They listened through walls, intercepted letters, and turned neighbors into informants. No one knew who to trust. A friendly smile might hide a report filed in secret. Even laughter sounded cautious. Meanwhile, West Germany moved at a different pace. The Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, had transformed into an economic powerhouse, driven by innovation and optimism. The economic miracle had turned bombed-out cities into bustling centers of trade and technology. Volkswagen, Siemens, and Lufthansa became global symbols of progress. The West German mark was strong, and so was its belief in democracy. Yet, prosperity brought its own kind of tension, questions of guilt, of memory, of how to live freely while the shadow of the past still loomed large. Berlin was both wound and window. Western visitors could climb platforms to peer over the wall to look at the other Berlin, a world frozen in gray. Soldiers with machine guns patrolled beneath them. For tourists, it was a sight; for Berliners, it was a heartbreak. Every brick told a story of families split, friendships silenced, dreams buried under barbed wire. The wall wasn't just a structure, it was a reminder that the Cold War wasn't a headline, it was a daily reality. By the 1970s, the world had settled into uneasy patterns. The Cold War had become a grim routine, spies traded in the shadows, propaganda flooded airwaves, and both sides built weapons that could destroy the planet many times over. Yet somewhere in the middle of that madness, small cracks began to form, not in the wall, but in the politics that sustained it. Western leaders started to believe that confrontation could be replaced by communication. The new word was détente, a slow thaw in the frozen hostility between East and West. In 1969, West Germany elected Willy Brandt as chancellor, a man who believed in reconciliation rather than rivalry. He knew Germany couldn't change the past, but maybe it could soften the present. His policy, known as Ostpolitik, aimed to build bridges to open dialogue with East Germany and the Soviet bloc. When Brandt knelt before the Holocaust Memorial in Warsaw in 1970, the world saw more than a gesture, it saw a nation confronting its conscience. Treaties were signed, embassies opened, and for the first time, East and West Germans could visit each other under limited agreements. It wasn't freedom, but it was something, a human breath in a political storm. For East Germans, though, life remained carefully measured. The government boasted about social security, education, and full employment, and indeed, no one starved. But the price was steep. Individuality was sacrificed for conformity. Western TV and radio, smuggled in through antennas and whispers, painted a different picture. In the glow of flickering screens, families watched images of Western cities bursting with color and choice. The contrast was painful. Many East Germans stopped believing in the promises of their state, but they learned to hide their doubts behind polite smiles and practiced loyalty. The youth, especially, began to feel the weight of stagnation. They grew up in a world where ambition was a threat and dreams were state property. Music became a quiet rebellion. Western rock songs, banned but beloved, drifted through illegal cassette tapes. Jeans and leather jackets became small acts of defiance. Art turned subtle, coded with meaning that only the brave understood. The wall was physical, but the rebellion was spiritual. Beyond Germany, the Cold War played its dangerous games. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Cuba. Yet Berlin remained its most potent symbol. Every global crisis echoed in its streets. When the superpowers flexed their muscles, Berliners listened for the rumble of tanks. But instead of bullets, they fought with patience, a silent resistance made of endurance and memory. Decades passed this way, each year adding another layer of concrete around both the city and its people's hearts. And then came the 1980s, a decade that began with rigidity and ended with revolution. East Germany was aging, its leaders locked in outdated speeches and hollow parades. The people, weary of promises, began to murmur again. They saw cracks forming in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, who spoke of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, reform. His words rippled across Eastern Europe like forbidden music. The East German government tried to muffle the tune, but it was too late. A generation that had grown up behind the wall was ready to question everything. In West Germany, life had become comfortable, almost complacent. The wall had faded into the background, an ugly but accepted fact. Yet the news from the East stirred something dormant, hope. Church groups, intellectuals, and young activists began to organize meetings in Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin. They spoke carefully at first, then louder. They demanded change not with weapons, but with words. "We are the people," they chanted, their voices trembling but unstoppable. The Stasi tried to silence them, but even fear has limits. The human spirit, once cornered long enough, pushes back. Throughout the 1980s, the divide in Germany remained, but the certainty behind it began to crumble. The East's economy faltered, factories slowed, and shortages became routine. The West watched, cautiously optimistic. No one could predict it yet, but history was preparing its quietest and most powerful storm. The wall, once the most permanent thing in Europe, was starting to tremble not from outside attacks, but from within. For almost 30 years, Berlin had lived as two cities sharing one name. The children who had once played in its ruins were now adults with families of their own, still separated by the same slabs of stone. But they had changed, and so had the world. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe was rusting. Something unstoppable was stirring, the soft, persistent hum of freedom. The wall still stood at the end of the 1980s, defiant and gray. But beneath its surface, under the graffiti and the slogans, under the weight of watchtowers and wires, something was cracking, something not even concrete could hold forever. The night the wall fell. It started with confusion, not gunfire, not speeches, not orders shouted through radios. Just confusion. A bureaucrat misspoke at a press conference, a journalist misunderstood, and the next thing the world knew, the most impenetrable border in Europe began to crumble under the weight of its own silence. On the night of November 9, 1989, Berlin was alive again, not with fear this time, but with footsteps, laughter, and the sound of hammers striking stone. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had divided a nation and a people. It had watched children grow up on either side, lovers separated, families torn apart. But that night, something extraordinary happened, something no one had dared to imagine for a generation. Thousands of East Berliners, tired of waiting for permission, poured into the streets. Word spread like wildfire, the border is open. Whether it was true or not didn't matter anymore. People went anyway, running, crying, singing. They didn't carry weapons, they carried hope. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, a young border guard named Harold Jaeger stood facing a crowd that stretched into the darkness. He had no clear orders, only a line of people shouting, begging to be let through. The crowd grew restless, pressing closer. Jaeger hesitated. His superiors were silent. His training told him to hold the line. His conscience told him history had already crossed it. Finally, just before midnight, he gave a simple command: open the barrier. And just like that, the wall that had caged millions for 28 years ceased to exist in spirit, even before its concrete began to fall. They came pouring through, men in work coats, women clutching children, students with tears streaking their faces. They hugged strangers, shouted across the divide, climbed onto the wall itself. From the western side, Berliners rushed forward to meet them, pulling them up, handing them champagne, flowers, anything they could find. People danced on the same concrete that had once meant death to approach. Soldiers stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or join. By dawn, pieces of the wall had already been chipped away, each fragment a trophy of freedom. The air was electric, charged with disbelief and joy. History had turned, not with violence, but with courage. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the collapse of stone, it was the collapse of fear. Across Eastern Europe, one dictatorship after another began to unravel. In Poland, Solidarity's movement triumphed. In Czechoslovakia, crowds flooded Prague's squares, ringing keys to symbolize a new beginning. Hungary opened its borders, and Romania's tyrant fell. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for nearly half a century dissolved, almost overnight. What years of war couldn't achieve, the quiet persistence of human hope finally did. For Germany, the impossible had suddenly become reality. Within weeks, families once separated by walls and watchtowers reunited in tears. Streets that had been cut in half came back to life. Churches overflowed with songs of thanksgiving. East Germans, who had grown up under slogans of control, now whispered a single word again and again: Freiheit, freedom. But freedom came with uncertainty. The question of what came next hung heavy in the air. Two nations, two systems, two generations of difference, could they truly become one again? In the months that followed, euphoria met complexity. East Germany, stripped of its rigid structures, faced chaos. The economy collapsed almost overnight as state industries failed to compete in a free market. Unemployment rose, old guarantees vanished, and the glow of liberation dimmed for many. Yet, even amid hardship, there was no turning back. The dream of unity was too powerful to surrender. Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany saw the opportunity and moved swiftly, proposing a plan to merge not just the lands, but the hearts and futures of all Germans. What belongs together must grow together, he declared, and the world listened. Negotiations began, cautious and historic. The Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, still technically held rights over Germany since the end of World War II. Each had to agree before reunification could happen. It was a diplomatic dance, delicate and decisive. But times had changed. The Cold War was ending, and even the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, saw that history could not be reversed. Life punishes those who come too late, he once said, and this time, he did not stand in the way. Finally, on October 3, 1990, Germany was officially reunited. The flags of East and West came down, and a single black-red-gold banner rose over a nation reborn. In Berlin, crowds flooded the streets again, not in protest or desperation, but in celebration. Fireworks exploded above the Brandenburg Gate, a monument once trapped between two worlds. For the first time in decades, it stood open, not as a symbol of division, but of renewal. Germany was whole again. The ripple spread far beyond its borders. Across Europe, nations that had been locked behind the Iron Curtain began to find their own voices. The Soviet Union, weakened and divided, collapsed 2 years later, bringing an end to the Cold War itself. The continent that had once been split between East and West began to heal. New alliances formed, borders opened, and a new Europe took shape, not perfect, not without conflict, but united by the memory of what division had cost. In Berlin, the wall's remains became a memorial. Artists covered its fragments with colors and messages: peace, unity, remembrance. Tourists walked where soldiers once patrolled. Children born after 1989 found it hard to believe that their city had ever been divided. Yet, the memory lingered in the eyes of their parents, in the way old friends hugged a little tighter, in the quiet disbelief that something so immense had actually fallen. But reunification was not just political. It was deeply human. It meant learning to speak to each other again, the East and the West, those who had been watched and those who had been free. It meant rediscovering trust, rebuilding faith, and forgiving history. It took years, perhaps decades, for the invisible walls inside people's hearts to crumble. Even today, traces of the divide remain in economics, in culture, in memory. Yet the unity achieved that night in 1989 proved something far greater, that even the most powerful walls cannot outlast the human desire to be free. Looking back now, the image remains indelible: a young man standing on top of the Berlin Wall, arms raised, as floodlights blaze around him and crowds cheer below. Behind him, the gray slabs stretch into the night; before him, the city glows. He doesn't yet know what comes next: the challenges, the politics, the rebuilding. But in that moment, he doesn't care. For the first time in his life, he stands on both sides of history at once. The wall had divided Germany for 28 years. It took only one night of courage to bring it down. And in that night, not only Germany, but the whole of Europe, found its heartbeat again.